if you went for a walk with Leslie, it was always an education. He really instilled in me this notion of you don't just show up and you're like, hey, you want to look at this? Hey, you want to look at that? You really needed to know and understand the product. And real estate's super simple. And I always tell people in my office, don't over-intellectualize it. It's simple, there are assets. But you do need to understand the assets because in telling a story, which may very well be the provenance of a building, of a townhouse very often, who was it built by? When was it built? Who were the owners? What did they do for a living? Because making that story makes things more interesting and you want to pull the customer into these things.
I don't usually wear a tie, but I heard you talking about, and I kind of agree with it, and it's kind of a Paul Massey thing as well. If guys are out there earning, 6-figure checks, the least they can do is put on a shirt and tie. So.
Well, I really am a big believer in it. I mean, you talked about how I started in the business, and I didn't start working with my father because he didn't want me in the office until I'd learned elsewhere. And so during college, I spent a couple of summers working in real estate, first with at William A. White & Sons. I worked for an appraiser, a guy named Bob Van Anken. And I basically just did, whatever nonsense needed getting done, whether it was going to take pictures of a property or, running some simple numbers, because Bob wouldn't rely upon me to come up with numbers, but running simple numbers, I think that was super useful. We touched briefly upon valuation earlier. And that's as good a way as you can get, right? It's like, what are the comparables, or what's the income that's being generated, to just come up with value and get an understanding of value. That was super useful. And then between my junior and senior year, I worked for a guy named Jerry Richter, also at William A. White & Sons. So this was probably around 87, as a leasing broker, as a commercial leasing broker. And Jerry said to me, he's like, well, what are you doing after college? And I was like, I don't know. And he said, well, why don't you come back, give me a call in August, take the summer off, call me in August, and we'll get you going here. And I was like, okay, sure. And as it relates to being successful in the business, I had amazing training at William A. White & Sons in that, first off, I graduated from college. I called Jerry Richter. I said, he doesn't return my call. Call him again. He doesn't return my call. Call him again. Doesn't return my call. Literally 25 phone calls. Doesn't return my call. Nothing. And I said to my father, Leslie, I said, Dad, what should I do? He said, just keep calling him. And sure enough, I did. And eventually he picks up the phone and he's like, oh, hey, Jed, as though nothing had happened. He's like, when are you starting, next week? And I said, sure. Yeah, right. I'll be in on Monday. So the very first day I go into his office and he says to me, where the World Trade Center is? And I said, yeah. He said, great, go canvass it. And I took a yellow pad, and I guess they gave me some business cards. And at the time, it really was pre-significant security in the buildings. And I took the elevator up to, 101 or 102 of One World Trade Center, and knocked on every single door. At 1, 2, and at the time there were 7 buildings there. 7 was like the commodities exchange.
What year was this?
This was 80, so I graduated 85. So it was probably 80.
Late 80s.
Yeah, it was late 80s. And I finished canvassing and I had a yellow pad filled with names and numbers, and I went back to the office. It took me, I was very diligent. It probably took me 2 months. Because I knocked on every single door. It was like, hi, I'm Jed Garfield. I'm with William A. White & Sons, who handles real estate matters here, right? And most of these were these tiny trade representative offices. It was like the country of Madagascar, and they had 1,000 feet, right? And there was some guy sitting in there at a desk, and he was like, well, I guess that's me, right? And I was like, oh, can I have your name and number? And I wrote it down. Anyway, I finished the World Trade Center. I go back to the office. I said, Jerry, I've got all these names and numbers. He said, great. He said, you know where Rockefeller Center is? And I said, yeah. And he said, great, go canvass it. And did the exact same thing, just knocking on every single door. Again, probably when you started, part of it is because you don't know better. And you're like, oh, my boss said to me I had to knock on every door and get a name and telephone number. And I remember that was actually my first experience getting kicked out of a building. I was in the same building where NBC is. I don't know, maybe that's 30 Rockefeller Plaza. And a guard saying to me, like, what are you doing in here? And I was like, I'm talking to the tenants. And he's like, yeah, you can't do that. It's like, we're leaving the building now. And I was like, okay, that was sort of humiliating. But those two experiences, both working in appraisal and then doing door-to-door canvassing, which, as you know, as a salesman, it's a little humiliating. It's a little embarrassing. It's like, what are you, some guy who's like walking the streets? But I found then that when I started working with Leslie, my father, him saying to me, here's a stack of 3x5 index cards. It was pre-internet. It was really pre-computer. And he had an index card for every single townhouse in Manhattan. And it had a name and a telephone number, and it had notes, NFS, which was not for sale. And he would just give me a stack of cards, 91st Street, Park to Lex. It'd be in his outbox, and he'd say, here you go, make your calls. And that's what I did. But going from knocking on doors and having people literally like slam the door in my face or get kicked out of a building to being on a telephone, I was like, this is great. I was like, this is all I need to do is be on the phone. He did have a couple of rules. You mentioned about wearing a tie. Before I started working with him, which again was about 88 or 89, he said, look, Jed, he said, I don't know how this is going to work out. It's really just me and a secretary, and I think there's one other broker in the office. He said, but I want you to do a few things. One is you have to get in the office before I do, which at the time was 7:30 in the morning. He said, two, he said, don't lie to people on the phone. He said, it's a bad idea. He said, it's not that I'm Mr. Ethical, but he's like, you're going to forget and you're going to get caught and it's going to be a problem. And number three was wear a suit and tie, because it's the least you can do when you're earning, these days you can earn 7-figure fees, but at the time it was, 6-figure fees, 5-figure fees, even 4-figure fees, whatever it was. But it was just out of a sense of respect for the people that you're doing business with. And I've really haven't changed a whole lot since when I started with him in the late 80s, because I found that it's been very useful. I will say that the market and the brokerage business has definitely changed with the internet and with social media. I mean, quite frankly, doing something like this. By the way, thank you. Super nice of you to include
Thank you
me.
for coming on. And the reason why I wanted to have you on, and we'll unpack a few different things, like specialization, which is one thing that I really feel like Leslie Garfield stands for, building a boutique brokerage, which you've started to hit on there with your dad, and also just, the townhouse market in general. I find it like a very interesting asset class. And for you, so Jed Garfield, to me, you're the townhouse guy. You've built a great reputation. Leslie Garfield, which is the company named after your father, it's synonymous with New York City brownstone buildings, nice leafy streets. And I feel like what an amazing brand to have built. And for you as a multi-generational New Yorker, native Manhattan guy, what was it like with your dad starting out, and what was that business, Leslie Garfield, in those early days that you just started describing there? If you've been wondering what types of deals we've been working on,
we made it easy for you. Just click on the link, show notes below.
we're talking real deals and real opportunities.
Whether you're an investor or owner, or just curious to know what's going on behind the scenes.
Just click the link below and it'll bring you right to all of our available inventory.
Well, first off, it was really interesting working with my father, and I am appreciative and thankful on a daily basis, still to this day, that I had that opportunity to work with him. But perhaps like your father, my father worked. Like, that's what he did. And I got up for school and left at 8 o'clock in the morning. He was always gone. He was like, without question, because he was in the office by then. And so the time that I actually got to spend with my father as a kid was Saturdays. And very often on a Saturday, he had a place up in Massachusetts, but if we didn't do that, he worked. And we would have a bagel or something at 8 in the morning, and then we'd walk down to his office at 595 Madison Avenue, which was the Fuller building, still is the Fuller building. And Leslie would do some paperwork, and then we would go show properties. And I was sort of like his cute little sidekick, and he'd be showing on a Saturday typically. And then we would typically walk up Madison Avenue. My father was a passionate collector of art, and we'd stop in at the different galleries and go to Sotheby's Park Bernay, which at the time was on Madison Avenue, and then end up at the Metropolitan Museum very often, and just kind of wander the galleries. But it mattered because real estate was always part of my life. If you went for a walk with Leslie, it was always an education. He would say, so-and-so lives here, so-and-so lives there. I sold this building to the government of Iran. I sold that property to, I don't know, Hugh Hefner, whatever, whoever it was. And he really instilled in me this notion of, you don't just show up and you're like, hey, you want to look at this? Hey, you want to look at that? You really needed to know and understand the product. And real estate's super simple. And I always tell people in my office, don't over-intellectualize it. It's simple, there are assets, but you do need to understand the assets, because in telling a story, which may very well be the provenance of a building, of a townhouse very often, who was it built by? When was it built? Who were the owners? What did they do for a living? Because making that story makes things more interesting, and you want to pull the customer into these things.
And when someone's about to write a pretty big check, I feel like they almost, a little bit different to my world in investment sales, but they almost want to be a part of a story or to understand the history.
They absolutely do. And there are certain blocks where you can say to someone, oh yeah, there's a Goldman partner over there, and this guy's in the private equity business, and this guy's, I don't know, has a fashion brand, and this woman's an actress. Those are things that really resound with people and really make a difference to them when making a decision, because I think ultimately all of us want to be included in something. And it may be very often with real estate because you want to be part of a wealthy club.
And something bigger than yourself as well.
And absolutely.
Right.
Something
Legacy.
bigger than, yeah.
And if you buy a piece of Manhattan like that, it's a different feeling, I think, compared to a condo or a co-op where you're buying into a community maybe. When you're buying a townhouse, you're really buying a little piece of the island. You are,
and you're also buying a certain personality type, because I think that, very often, certainly traditionally, townhouses were represented independence. Getting into a co-op, big deal. Buying an apartment, big deal. But having a townhouse was sort of like, look, I'm living in my own world. I'm living in my own space. I don't need to prove anything to anybody. It was also sort of a bastion of people who couldn't get into good buildings. I mean, so it was a combination of the two things. I think that has changed over time. I think that there was a long period where townhouses were a great way to graduate from a classic 6, classic 7 apartment, whether it was on Park Avenue or Fifth Avenue or Central Park West, into, a place with 5 bedrooms or something, an outdoor space. And I think that made a big difference to people. That said, with the coming of guys like Gary Barnett and now Naftali, who are building these huge apartments, 5, 6 bedrooms, it's actually detracted to a certain degree from townhouses, because people are like, if I buy a house, I've got to renovate it. Who knows what's going to happen with the city? It's a big pain in the butt. I'll just buy something that's done. Someone's giving me the key. But the key to that is that builders are building much larger apartments now. Whereas for years and years, new condominiums would be like 40 studios, 81 bedrooms, 102 bedrooms. And like that was it. Nobody was building bigger units. So that's made a big difference. But certainly the history of townhouses is of interest to our customers.
Thanks for listening to the Broker Brunch. We've now brought you a ton of episodes and we hope we're providing a lot of value. If you have any ideas of people you'd like to see on future episodes, please drop it in the comments so we can make it happen. Tell me about the importance of specialization in your space. So obviously townhouses is a very distinct asset type. And I've heard you describe Leslie Garfield as not big, but big within the space.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really good way of defining your company and your firm. Talk to me about that, about specializing in one asset class over the other.
Well, the big, but big within the space, is true, but that's actually not my thought. Rick Pretzfelder, my partner of like 20 plus years, actually came up with that. And I was like, oh, I'm going to use that, Rick. I was like, because it's true. And it really is dead on that we are we're a smaller firm. I think we're vastly larger than when we started, where there were 3 of us, but now there are 25 of us. So we've grown and now we have 2 offices. But I think that specialization makes a difference. Again, I think most real estate transactions are pretty simple. There's a seller who wants a price and a buyer who wants to usually pay less than that price. And getting to that place is really what you get paid for. And I think that having a specialization is true, by the way, of any business. It's not just real estate. It's not just what we do. It's not just what you do on a day-to-day basis. I will often say to people, they'll say, like, who should do the legal on this? There are like 3 guys that we send all of our legal business to because all they do is specialize in townhouses and super high-end sales. And it's not that, again, the transaction is so difficult, but it's the grease in the wheels. It just makes it that much easier to do the deal. Efficiency. And as you know, deals die for all kinds of reasons. And if you can remove some of those roadblocks by having a market knowledge and by having the experience of having sold, I've sold, maybe 600 or 700, properties over my career. It's not, as I say to my wife all the time, it's not that what I do is so complicated, but you do need to know what you're doing. And I think that makes a big difference. It really does. And I think owners understand that, buyers understand that. Specialization, though, just to come back to that, does matter. I would say, I think close to 90% of our business is sell-side business, which is something that I learned from Paul and Bob when I first started, because Leslie was a solo practitioner. Paul and Bob came into the market, and all of a sudden, it was like, I was like, Dad, why didn't we get that business? Leslie, why didn't we get that business? Who are these 2 guys? Like, they're commercial brokers. And I remember, I think, having lunch with Paul, and Paul said something as simple as like, look, we're only working on sell side because then we know we're going to get paid. And I took that to heart. And from that day, literally, we spend almost all of our time working the sell side, signing things up, because then you have the other 7,000 members of the real estate board in New York working for you. And you know that you're going to get paid. So that, and by the way, the specialization by extension then really resonates with townhouse owners, because then we can spend all of our money focusing on townhouse owners and saying, look, this is what we've done. This is why you should hire us. This is our track record of dealing specifically with townhouses. So feel free to hire your sister-in-law, because you want to, because there's a lot of that in the residential space.
Yes.
But you're not going to get the same transparency. You're not going to get the same ease of making a deal happen. And you're certainly not going to get the knowledge that you need when you run into headaches like things related to certificate of occupancy or things related to DHCR, or having the knowledge to know that because we're representing these other 8 townhouses within a 12-block radius, we know who's shopping. It just makes for a more efficient market.
And you've layered in within that asset type specialization, which I really like, is that you've layered in that neighborhood territory system, it seems like. And I'm glad you brought up Paul and Bob, because it just reminds me of that.
But it is that, and it's exactly that. And every time, I think I had lunch with Paul maybe a couple months ago, and it's interesting to me because Paul is, I don't know, maybe it's like 5 years older than I am or something like that. As is Bob, maybe Bob's a couple years older than I am. And my father was 20 years older than those guys, or maybe 30 years older than those guys. And Leslie had a way of doing business that worked until it didn't work. And the reason why it didn't work was because these guys came into the business and said, you know what we're going to do? We're going to split up the whole city and we're going to make it market specific. And
once they organized it like that, it was very hard to compete from the outside, because they would take back the information from Chelsea, downtown, the Upper West Side, Upper East Side, feed it into the mothership, and then share it into reports throughout the city. How do you keep up if you're not a specialist?
I really do attribute, and I've said this to both Paul and Bob over the years, a lot of my success and a lot of the success of the firm, even though I never worked at Massey, they really taught me the value of sort of combining a commercial transaction and blending it with a residential transaction in a way that no one else had done before. And quite frankly, that still to this day, not a lot of my competitors do. And it always sort of stuns me. I'm like, you know, this works. Like, it's effective. It's not rocket science. And the people who work for me are not rocket scientists. I mean, everyone's bright enough. But do this basic, what we would refer to as, and you know, blocking and tackling.
Yeah.
You pick up the phone, you make your calls, and you know, and yeah, are a bunch of people going to hang up on you and tell you to screw off? Yeah, that happens. But for those people who are willing to listen to you, you've got to have something of value to offer to them. And if you do, then at least you'll have an opportunity to sign up the business. And that's all you can ask for. They may still hire their sister-in-law if that happens, but that's okay.
That's life.
Right,
So
that's life.
And then with the you made me remember my own canvassing days as well when you were telling that story, because, and like you said, when your boss tells you to do something, you kind of just go do it. Like,
Yeah.
I spent 3 months in the winter, so it was January, February, March, canvassing Inwood in Washington Heights. And it was like, you know, it was 20, 25 degrees a lot of the days. And like a lot of those neighborhoods, you know, you're walking around there and it's really like, what am I doing, you know?
Yeah.
And it's like freezing cold, you're taking photos of buildings. And all of this information is available on Property Shark. It's all available online, Google Maps. And I remember almost being like, am I crazy? Is this like just a test that they're laughing at me to see how long I'll stay out here?
Yeah.
But I did it. I cataloged, I took the photos, I saw every block. And even though I almost resented it at the time when I was doing it, it was the fastest way for me to learn a couple of square miles or whatever it was, because even to this day, I can think back and remember what 172nd and St. Nicholas looks like, or what's going on with developments up on Broadway. And there's no other way I would have done that unless there was the actual task of taking the photo of every building. Because you can say to folks, go and drive the area and get acquainted with it and get to learn it. But there's something about having the job to do, the photo to take, upload it to the system. This is old school stuff. I mean, people would probably really think this is like archaic. But do you think that the folks today are actually handicapped a little bit because they have so much tech and IT at their fingertips that they probably don't go out and do, as you call it, the blocking and tackling as much?
I mean, my sense is that you're more effective if you're willing to do the hard work, just period. I mean, it just, you can canvas off Property Shark, no question. And there are all kinds of public databases that are available to you now. And you can reach people now. But there's still, I don't think there's anything quite like seeing the super on the corner who says something like, oh yeah, those guys have been fighting a lot, man. The cops were here or something like that. And all of a sudden you're like, bam, they're getting divorced, right? That's not a good situation for them, but it could be a good situation for me. And then you track somebody down, but a lot of it is like those little nuggets that you pick up when you're walking the street. And I don't think there's anything quite like it. I still ask people to do that all the time, but it is more challenging to get younger people to do the hard work, I think, of knocking on doors. I really do. To their detriment.
To their detriment.
Yeah.
For building a boutique brokerage, or maybe even saying it better, staying boutique. And I feel like in a world where it seems like Compass have bought so many brokerages, and I know City Habitats became, Corcoran, and Town fell by the wayside. So there's just been a lot of merging, a lot of shuffling. What is important to you for the future of Leslie Garfield, or why have you stayed boutique and nimble when everyone else seems to be merging?
Well, we do get approached semi-regularly about selling the business. I just don't see a huge benefit to it. I mean, I could probably, not even probably, there's a good likelihood I'd make more money if I sold the business and went to work at Compass or whatever, any of these big brands. I like having my name on the door. I get a kick out of it. I'm very proud of it. I'm very proud of my father and the legacy that he left.
Does it make you feel closer to him having that name?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Like no question about it. But I think it resonates with people. I can't always tell. But I do think that I just got a call the other day from someone who Leslie had sold a house to 70 years ago, and they said, oh, well, we're moving into an assisted living, would you come over? And it's like, that to me is kind of like, it both felt great because I was like, wow, that's so nice that they still thought of Leslie after all these years. And the guy even said to me, he said, I know, your dad passed away a couple of years ago, blah, blah, blah. But I really, really like that. And to me, at least, whether or not it means that to other people, I think it does. Having the Garfield name and specializing in one thing, I think makes a difference. And we've been able to survive so far. I mean, I don't know. We'll see. We'll see what happens next year. But
thank you for listening to the Broker Brunch. If you enjoy the show, please hit subscribe so we can reach more people. I think buyers, sellers, the market in general are so inundated with information and with different things happening that there is something to be said for what you just mentioned, which is that simplistic. We only sell townhouses. We only sell them in these neighborhoods, and we only work for owners. And I think having 2 or 3 things that can get through the noise for an owner like that, for example, right, who mightn't have access to capital markets or real estate markets and might just remember a guy called Leslie Garfield.
Yeah.
You punch it into Google, Garfield, you see, oh, there's the company is still going. Let me call his son.
Yeah.
That's a beautiful thing.
I think it's a beautiful thing. And as I said, I mean, it makes me proud. It's, I do occasionally think about our competitors, and I think about being all things to all people, but it's not to say that there aren't fantastic brokers out there, a lot better than me, who do everything. They'll sell high-end condos, they'll sell townhouses, they'll sell things in Miami, they'll sell things out in East Hampton. Part of it is just an insecurity. I hate the idea of someone calling me and me not being able to speak intelligently about a market. Someone calling me and saying, Jed, yeah, you sold me this great $25 million house. I'm looking at something on Further Lane out in East Hampton. They're asking me $20 for it. What's it worth? And to me, not being able to say to them, well, X sold for this, Y sold for that, so it's worth, Z, I would be really embarrassed to I both would be literally embarrassed by it, but I would also think, like, what am I getting paid for? Like, what's my value? What's my worth? So some people are tremendous marketers. There's a guy named Ryan Seacrest, Sirhan,
Yeah.
who's like, by the way, phenomenal. The guy's amazing. But when I went to go see a listing for someone who works for him the other day, and I was showing it, and they were like this like mediocre mom who's got kids in private school and like does this part-time. And I just thought, God, if I were Searhart, I wouldn't. I'd be embarrassed to have someone like this working for me. That said, he's not, and God bless, he probably earns 20 times what I earn in a year and doesn't seem to bother him. So clearly, look, I think the business means a little bit more to me than just the next dollar that I'm making. And I really want to have growth, and I really want to have consistency, and I really want to have people that have market knowledge that can speak intelligently to people. Because I don't want some half-assed guy who's like, oh, this is my fourth job. I worked at CBS, I worked here, I worked at, I was a barista for a little while. I worked in the whatever business. I worked on Wall Street selling stocks. I like the idea that someone's really good at something.
This might resonate with you as well, but I found that, so we operate similar to the Massey Knackle model as well, where we have a territory focus, Upper Manhattan and the Bronx. But I think by being very defined about what we do, and more importantly, what we don't do, has actually opened up a lot of doors for us. Because by saying no to that business and say referring a deal to Jed Garfield because we don't understand the townhouse market, you now see me as not your competition, but rather someone that when there's a multifamily building or a retail piece, let me call Brian and throw it back to him. And that happens across the gamut, I find.
Brian, that's so well said. And I think that is so true. When I was younger, I was a real pig. I was like, I can do it all. I can do everything. And I really have learned, certainly in the last 20 years, that if I have an asset that fits into something that you do, why would I not send it over to you? I don't know anything about the business. I wouldn't know the first place to turn. And why not send it to Brian, who's a guy who's made an entire market and made a career doing this?
And look how good that looks then to the client.
Oh, it looks great.
And it's like, wow, Jed could have made a couple of $100,000 there if he had tried to hoard the information and make something happen.
Yeah.
He introduced me to someone who's a pro. I now have more respect for Jed. I'm getting better service. And people remember that.
I think they do. There's some terrific, and there really are some terrific people in our business. There's a woman over at Sotheby's, Roberta, I can't think of her name. Anyway.
We'll have to look her up and link her in the show notes.
Yeah, exactly. And she's, but again, Matt Lesser, my other partner, taught me this. Matt's does a great job of reaching out to people in different parts of the business, being friendly, having good relationships. And for years, I was like, what is he doing? These guys are our competitors. But he really made it very clear to me that people like Brian are not my competitors. They're people whom are in the business, who I can share information with, learn things, and as you wisely point out, make a very compelling case to an owner to say, oh, wow, that's professional. And that does make a big difference.
Talk to me about the townhouse market. So what's the opportunity out there? How big is that market? What kind of velocity does it have on an average year?
So, again, as you pointed out, we've sort of broken up the city into a bunch of different neighborhoods: Upper East, Upper West, Midtown East, Midtown West, Lower East, Lower West, and Chelsea separately. each of those, and when we opened an office in Brooklyn about, I think, 4 years ago now, which has been phenomenal. I think that the strongest market currently is out in Brooklyn. And part of that, as it relates to volume, is there's just huge volume. Last year in Park Slope, we have close to, I think there are a total of, 1,140 townhouses, single family townhouses in Park Slope. And there was turnover. I think there was something like 122 transactions. I mean, we don't need to represent a lot of those to make good money on that kind of thing. There are competitors out there, no question about it. But one of the nice things about having the Leslie Garfield brand is that we've been able to kind of hit people over the head with that in Brooklyn, and it's been a super good market for us. In terms of opportunity or opportunities that are out there, we are starting to see developers come back into the market. I think, as you know, as always, when rates come down, it makes a difference on the commercial side of things. I just represented some people on 64th Street that sold a property to a developer. And what was compelling to the developer, which is true, is there's not a lot of new development in the townhouse field right now. And nobody wants to do work. They want something completed. They want something done. These guys are going to be finished at a time where, as far as I can tell, there will be zero new product on the market in 2 years when they're going to be finished with this thing. And I said, quite frankly, even if you do a mediocre job, there's going to be a market for it. Because if there's one thing I've learned over doing this for 33 years, everybody loves new. New. And you walk around Manhattan, you walk around Upper East, you walk around Upper West, you walk around in the Village, you walk around in Brooklyn Heights, and you think, how can they keep on building this stuff? Naftali, how does he keep on putting up, 120 units at a time with an average price at $7 million, and they all get
because
sold
demand
like
in Manhattan is always constant. It's just a question of supply.
It really is. It's just a question of supply. And if you can provide something brand new, and I mean literally like no one's lived there before, that stuff just sells. It sells itself.
We're back. Another season of the Broker Brunch podcast. Summertime in New York. We've got a lot of exciting conversations coming up. We hope you enjoy listening.
It feels like that the play used to be buy a vacant townhouse, convert it to apartments. Then a few years ago, I noticed folks were buying vacant apartments and converting it back to a townhouse, to a single family.
So it is interesting. And I do think that the markets go up and down. Almost all of the townhouse properties and brownstones throughout Manhattan, throughout Brooklyn, were built originally as single family houses. That's what they were built for. They weren't super luxury. You had super luxury between 5th and Madison. You had super luxury between Central Park West and Columbus, and then over on Riverside. But for the most part, they were sort of like middle of the market townhouses. And I think come the Depression and when the economy went bad, a lot of these were chopped up and converted into apartments. There was a little bit of transition back over the years, but for the most part, they really stayed that way. I think at a point in the late 90s, 2000s, when people who were customers of ours, people in private equity, people who were partners at Goldman Sachs, people who were in all the money businesses that were making a lot of money, were making so much money that the idea of getting a discount on a piece of real estate that had been converted into apartments, yet that they could convert back, represented, as you suggested, Brian, a value opportunity. So there has been a lot of that coming back, which is there has been ripping out of apartments, creating single family houses. There's actually a little bit of a lack of inventory of apartments in townhouses now. And we often get requests for that. We don't really deal in that market. It tends to be a little bit different than what we do. But there are not a lot, statistically, of townhouse properties that remain broken up into apartments on the Upper East Side. The Upper West Side, there's still a fairly, I think something like 27 or 28% of the townhouses on the Upper West Side, 60th to 96th Street, Central Park West to the river, continue to be broken up into stabilized, controlled, tenanted, multi-tenant properties, the balance of which are single family. But there's certainly overall a movement back to single family. No question, Brian.
So when we sell buildings or when we're pitching to an owner in investment sales, there's a few distinct buckets of motivation, right, that we usually try and target. There's a mortgage coming due,
right?
A 1031 need coming up, some sort of partnership dispute. But these are all very much business-oriented types of decisions. In your world, in that residential townhouse,
it's death and divorce.
Death and divorce.
Death and divorce. Like that's...
But not DEBT, it's the actual someone passing away?
Well,
because I imagine a lot of these are free and clear, right?
A lot, well, yeah. I mean, it's very rarely money-related, particularly when they're owner-user, properties, when families have been living there. But you actually have death, divorce, and graduation. Very often when people's last child goes off to college, they're then living in a 5,000 square foot house on, 5 floors or something like that. And they think, who needs this? I mean, it's just quite literally, it's like, they're living on the ground floor, maybe the living room on the second floor, and then the master bedroom. And there are 2 floors that are empty.
The vertical aspect of these townhouses don't lend themselves to someone who has trouble getting up and down the stairs,
They
right?
don't, but it's actually interesting. There are a lot of much, much older people that remain in townhouses. And I really do think to some degree, walking up and down the stairs every day may, in fact, be good for people's
Longevity.
health. It may, but really, I mean, you did touch on something, Brian, which is that you do have partnership disputes and commercial deals, leases come up, financing issues. The townhouse business is a lot less driven by that, and it is a lot more driven by death and divorce. I mean, divorce is big.
That's why storytelling in your world is so important. I feel like because our world is okay, there's characters and there are stories, but the numbers really are the starting point to the numbers make sense. Is this a good investment? Your world is more like...
It's much more emotional.
This person had a crazy argument with their spouse and now they're moving to Saudi Arabia.
I had a great customer years ago. By the way, this actually brings all of these things together. Years ago, I had a customer who was looking for a house in Carnegie Hill. I couldn't find anything. I was on the phone with people. I kept on getting shut down, and there was nothing on the market that they hadn't seen. And there was one house on 92nd Street between 5th and Madison, and I couldn't reach the owner. I don't know, maybe they had an unlisted number or something like that. And I walked over and I knocked on the door, and this guy answers the door and he said, "Yeah, can I help you?" And I said, "Yeah." I said, "I'm trying to reach, Mr. Ammon or Mrs. Ammon. Are they around?" And he said, "Who are you?" And I said, "Well, I'm Jed Garfield." And I gave him my card. And he said, "Wait here." It turned out he was the Ammon's butler, right? This is the type of world that these people live in. Anyway, long story short, wife comes downstairs and says, "Oh, yeah, we are thinking of selling, but my husband's already talking to Douglas Elliman and Stribling, but give him a call at the office. Here's his number." And at the time, Mr. Ammon was a partner, the youngest partner ever at KKR, the big private equity company. And I called him, spoke to his assistant. "Yeah, Ted's busy now." Called him again, called him again, called him again, called him again. His assistant couldn't have been nicer. "Yeah, Ted would love to talk to you, but he's on a call." That night, Karen and I, my wife and I, were driving up to our house in Massachusetts, and my flip phone, that's when the period was, rings, and it's Ted Ammon. And he says, "Hi." He said, "This is Ted. I know you've been trying to reach me about the house." He said, "Look, I'm already talking to Douglas Elliman and Stribling. They want 6 points, and 5 points, and I think they're pigs." And I said, 5 and 4. And he said, "Done." He said, "Do we need to paper this?" And I said, "I don't need to paper it if you don't need to paper it." And he said, okay, we've got a deal. Sure enough, I sell this house to a very nice couple. And it was a big deal at the time. I don't know, it was 12 or $13 million. It was a big deal. And I made both sides of the fee. And ultimately, Ted and his wife were moving to Surrey in England because I think Ted was opening the KKR office in London. And I get a call from his secretary, and she says, listen, Ted's going to be in New York, and he wants to find a place to live. And I was like, okay, great. And I sort of knew in the back of my mind this was a divorce. You just pick up on these things. And Ted comes in. I ultimately sold him an apartment at 1107 Fifth for like a lot of money. I don't know, $10 million. And then his wife, who he was getting divorced from, called me and said, Jed, I need a house. And I was like, well, what do you want to spend? She said, it doesn't matter. Ted's paying for it. And I was like, okay. I sold her a house, I think, for $15 million. She starts working on the house. And in the news, there's all this stuff about Ted and Generosa getting divorced. And Ted calls me up one day and he said, Jed, he said, I think I'm going to sell the apartment. Come over and meet me at the apartment. List the apartment for sale with me. And I get a call 2 days later, and it's from Ted's lawyer, who at this point I've gotten to know. And he said, look, I don't want you talking to any reporters. You're going to start getting calls tomorrow. And I was like, what? Sure enough, New York Times, front page, next morning, financier murdered in East Hampton.
What?
And turns out Ted's ex-wife had hired her contractor to kill Ted, which he did. And so Ted now is dead. I have the apartment for sale still. Generosa, the wife, is arrested for being complicit in the murder. I get that house for sale.
Must have been pinching yourself saying, what am I involved in here?
This was just a quick aside. Before any of this happened, Generosa had called me at the office and she said, I want you to meet me. There used to be a hotel on 82nd and 5th Avenue, directly across the street from the Metropolitan Museum. And she meets me there with her butler. And she says, Ted and I are getting divorced, and that bastard thinks he can leave me with it's like $100 million or something, in the house in this palace in England and the boat. And if he thinks I'm going to go away, he's got another thing coming. And I was like, what world is this? Like, what is going on here? Anyway, long story short, so Ted's dead. The general contractor, accused, indicted, found guilty of murder, goes to prison. Generosa, who has now inherited the entire estate, dies of breast cancer 3 months later. So now this entire group of people is dead. They have 2 kids who they had adopted, 2 Russian kids who they adopted, who go live with Ted's sister down in South Carolina. But I think as a result, super long-winded way of discussing, ultimately from that single knock on the door, I think I did close to $100 million worth of business.
Which is incredible, because I would have thought, like, how in the residential space, for us, the lifeblood of the business, and that's an incredible story, by the way, but for us, the lifeblood of the business is, can you get repeat business? Can you get a client who owns a portfolio because they'll feed you every year? But you're saying through different life circumstances, you actually get fed from a divorce, from the husband to the wife to the kids.
But Brian, so the reason why that story resounds with me and why I tell it to the people in the office, they're probably sick of hearing about it, is because that's very rare. For the most part, you're in, you're out. Maybe you get 2 transactions. I actually have had a wonderful guy, developer, who did like 5 deals with me. So I made money going in and going out. But that's very, very rare.
Yeah,
it's very, very rare. For the most part, people have kids.
Right.
They move from as I say, classic 6, classic 7 into a townhouse. You sell it to them. Hopefully, when they're selling, typically 20, 25 years later when the last kid's gone to college, hopefully they remember you. Hopefully you've done a good enough job of staying in touch with them over the year with market information or sending them a bottle of wine or whatever it is, that you get it going out. Although, and you may have experienced this too, Brian, I mean, I'm 62. I'm starting to vaguely age out of the business because a lot of the people who are my age, they're either, they're retiring or maybe they have kids in the business, And so that's business I'm not getting.
For us, it's, and I had, on a recent show we were talking about this with, say, brokers under 40, and it's not really about getting the head of the firm. It's about getting who's the second guy in.
Yeah.
Can you make a relationship there? Because a lot of the time the head of the firm has his relationships from 20, 30 years.
That's right.
So you need to be cognizant of that handing off of the baton and be ready as a young broker, I feel like, to pounce on the opportunity.
I think that's really, really true. And I actually think that that's one of the things that some of the younger people in my office benefit from, which is that you've got a nice track record, which you guys have at Ripco. You guys have a great reputation. You've got a great track record for doing investment sales. And so that's something that a young broker can sort of piggyback off of, hopefully. But again, I actually think people like doing business with young people. They really do. And it's not even like an ageism thing. It's just kind of like people love someone who's excited and enthusiastic. I mean, I've done this deal so many times, right? And I'm kind of like, who is it, Kaylin? My assistant's like, oh, Mr. Smith's on the phone. I'm like, okay.
Well, in your defense, it's hard not to get, and I'm not saying you're cynical, but it's hard not to get somewhat cynical when you've dealt with like 30, 40 years of you. I'm sure at your stage, you can almost see where this is going before it even goes there. So it's probably hard to stay,
Brian. It is
excited.
It is, and it's one of the reasons why I think we've been able to grow the business over time from the 3 people it was when Leslie started to the 26 or 27 people we have today. Because as I've gotten older, you're both interested in younger people, and you're maybe a shade less interested in the next transaction. Because it's sort of like the same transaction that you did, the same transaction, I don't know, I was 27 or 28 when I did my first deal. I mean, I've done a lot of deals, and yes, net, the numbers change, but really everything else
the story
is exactly.
Before we wrap, Jed, I wanted to just get a sense, what are you excited about going into 2026?
Well, excited about. Well, we're in the midst of acquiring a small brokerage firm. So that's exciting to me because it's the first time we've ever acquired another business, which I've never done before. And boy, it is a lot of work and it's a lot of learning. I mean, there's a huge learning curve, which makes it exciting. We're sort of staffing up a little bit in Brooklyn, which is that's very exciting to me. And I think that just, we've got some young people that are really starting to make moves and that's exciting to me. So I'm excited about that. I want to get my golf handicap down. I'm hoping my son gets into law school. I mean, I don't know. My life is exciting, but on the real estate side, I don't know, another day, another dollar, another deal. I mean, you just keep going. And I enjoyed it. It was a pleasure talking to you, Brian. I mean, I'm going to interview you next time.
I would love that.
Because that really would be of interest to me. I think it's also great that you've been, and if you want to wrap this thing, that's fine, but I do think it's great that you've taken the time and the energy to make this a thing. And what did you say? You've done 40 of these? 46
this is number, 46, I believe.
46 of these?
Yeah.
I mean, as you and I both know, you could be doing other things rather than interviewing Jed. By the way, I love this stuff, but it's like it takes away from your work.
It does, but it's like what we were saying about the golf, being complimentary and you get to know someone on a different level. Every time I do a podcast with someone, I learn something new of a new relationship, and I almost use it as my own little platform for making relationships. And I have found it to be very effective, and it's enjoyable to do.
But how did you come up with it as a concept? I mean, were you just like, look, you're obviously an outgoing guy and you have the ability to speak with people, but were you just like, maybe I'll get this down, on film or get this down on tape? Or
I never had a grand plan for it, and it was just something that I love real estate. I love having conversations with people. How can we make those things together?
Who was your first guest?
My first guest was my partner Mitchell, and I did the first one together, talking about our story in real estate.
Yeah. And how did you meet Mitchell?
We met at B6 through Paul.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Second week there, he said, "Oh, Mitchell's from England. You're from Ireland. Come in.
You should be best friends."
Yeah. He doesn't
you guys are all the same.
Maybe he doesn't know the history.
You know what? As it relates to being excited about something, we've developed a partnership with a firm in London called Russell Simpson. Working on that's been fun, but that's more of like a fun thing than something I'm like, oh yeah, I'm going to make a lot of money from this. But it's been wonderful because there is so much, sort of cross-Atlantic business, and particularly in finance and in the market that we serve. So we're getting a lot of stuff back and forth between London and New York, which is, it's just fun because it's fun. It's fun to get on a plane and go to London 4 times a year. And
I always say London is the New York of Europe. I actually said that to someone living in London, and they were like, "That's actually kind of like disrespectful. Like, we're London.
Yeah.
New York is the London of America." But
okay. Well, maybe. Yeah.
I guess
can see how that.
They have a few years on us over here. But Jed Garfield, it's a real pleasure. Thank you so much.
Please,
and
thank you.
Looking forward to the next time.
This is great. Really. Thank you very much.
Cheers.